Well, Jim, our next question sent to CornyDriveThru@gmail.com from Jack in Indianapolis. Was Gary Hart considered a good manager by performers within the business? I ask because he never seemed to do anything during his guys' matches. And he never went to the WWF. Was that just his shtick? Not doing anything except look mean? Did other performers think he was useless ringside, but a good promo? Thanks.
Well, he did at one point, was about to go to the WWF, and I think that story's been told. Who was it? Was it Strongbow he had heat with or whatever? They didn't send anybody to pick him up. He got mad and went back.
It was either that, I think it was that, but for whatever reason, I thought he actually showed up at the building and pulled a knife on Strongbow, but maybe I'm wrong about the second.
Well, I mean, and it wouldn't have been a knife. It would have been a razor blade. But yes and no to all of the above, and I'll try to explain why. And, Uncle Gary, I liked Gary when I got to know him later on in our careers. But I, as a fan, and when I first got into business, I kind of thought the same thing. I think the problem is that Gary had such longevity, but he really, after the plane crash, and he kind of settled into the sinister playboy Gary Hart, I don't want to say character, gimmick, that he didn't really change a lot for the 80s. Dusty thought so highly of him. He was a huge drawing manager in the 70s in Florida. That was Dusty as a heel was part of the Gary Hart army before they switched him babyface, and Gary had Pac's song and they sold out everywhere, blah, blah, blah. Gary had learned to wrestle badly. He was not a good wrestler, never had a physique, and wasn't really, you can see the old Chicago tapes, but late 50s, early 60s, but his calling wasn't as a wrestler, but he had that voice and that delivery and that face, that expression, and he could make you believe things. So by the late 60s, as a manager, he was getting over, and he drew money in most places. And also, as a lot of the guys who excelled as managers were, he had a booking mind. And that's where he got his best reputation inside the business. To answer the question more directly, I think by the 80s, everybody that had to work with him as a manager at ringside probably was like, this is a little difficult. But he had more respect from people from the booking he had done. And in Dallas or in Atlanta, or, Barnett liked Gary because of his mind and how he could develop talent in kabuki. So he had a good reputation in the business, but there was when Flair was a baby face against Terry Funk in that series in 89, Gary's at ringside. Gary wouldn't put Flair over. When Flair's charging up to him, Gary just stood his ground, and Gary was bigger than Flair was. And you see Flair'd have to grab him and jerk him around a little bit to get him to just leave, but
there's a moment where you see the frustration in Flair. I think it was the Texas Death Match, or not the Texas Death Match, the I Quit match. I think it was that match. You see in his face, he goes back for a second. He's frustrated. Gary won't do anything.
Yeah. And part of it was after that plane crash, Gary, and that was 15 years after the crash.
Well, you can't play that card with Flair. Hey, I was in a plane crash. Well, guess what, buddy?
But at the same time, Gary couldn't take bumps and couldn't do a lot physically after that. So you had a heel manager that was really big and really menacing looking, but he could do only the barest things for you to get, even with him. And he wanted to keep his heat to the point where he didn't want to look scared of the baby faces. But like I said, by the time the 80s rolled around, national TV, TBS, there's me, there's Jimmy Hart, there's Heenan. We're bumping, we're being more over the top, so to speak. And Gary was different, but it was sometimes difficult for the baby faces to work with, and or sometimes the fans by that point thought, well, he's not really doing a lot, because he wasn't really doing a lot.
By that point in '89, it was you, it was Heyman, it was Teddy Long, it was Gary, and the rest of you, even Heyman. Heyman would at least like run around. He would move around. He may not
Yeah.
take bumps or do it well, but he was in motion. Gary would just kind of stand there and every now and then walk. And that was it.
Yeah. And I mean, less is more, but when it's so much less because it's the same thing were doing 20 years ago, that's a little too less.